how am I not going to tell my story because I'm scared of what other people are going to think about me, when literally that's what my story is all about. Not caring about what other people think about me and just pouring into myself the love and grace and all of that. So it was very challenging, but I just pushed forward and told myself, I have to tell this story because even if it doesn't connect for most people, it's going to connect with somebody. And I think it's important because as you see with all of our stories, there's a theme here. Like, we are all living different versions of lives, but there's a connection here, and that's what brings us together as just a human race.
Welcome to Business Beyond Usual. My name is Arpit Sharma, and we are recording live from the Ross School of Business once again. Today, we are going to talk about Voices of Ross. Before we get started, we want to encourage you to get in touch. We always love engaging with our listeners, and we'd love to hear from you. Send us a message at bbupodcast@umich.edu. That is bbupodcast@umich.edu. Follow us on Instagram at Ross_BBU. Again, that's Ross_BBU. And feel free to DM us here as well. Ask us questions, suggest episode topics, or just say hello. A quick note for our listeners. This episode is the first part of a two-part series, and we'll be talking about Voices of Ross. And in this episode, we'll be talking to a few of our guests who chose to speak up in a major event at Ross. To give you a little bit of a background, Ross hosts multiple of these events across the year where students can share their past experiences, past stories, very intimate stories at that, and be authentic in front of a large audience. And there's a long list of the events there. There's one event called WetX, which is focused on veterans. There's OutX, focused on LGBTQ community. There's International X, focused on internationals. There's East Meets West, which is focused on Asian Americans. There's First at Ross, where first-generation college students share their experiences. And there's another event called Story Lab, which is organized by the Sanger Leadership Center. In today's episode, we have 4 guests who spoke at multiple of these events, WetX, OutX, Story Lab, and we would like to hear from them about their experiences and their thoughts on the Ross community and their experiences before Ross, and we are very excited to hear that. We'll quickly start with introductions, and we'll start with you, Bryson.
Hi, yes. Bryson Porterfield, born and raised from New Jersey, currently MBA 1, so class of 2025. Yeah.
Yeah, my name's Christian Beckler. I am originally from the Los Angeles area, born and raised there, but lived all over the country. I'm a member of the class of 2024, so Section 5 and MBA 2.
Hi, Mark O'Connell. I'm from kind of all over the states in the world. I grew up a little bit on the East Coast, but I've lived in Paris, Mongolia, spent some time in California. So I'm on my 14th move here. Did 6 years in the Marine Corps before I came to Ross, and I'm now an MBA 1.
Damn. Which was your favorite city?
Ooh. I loved DC growing up, but Ulaanbaatar was a pretty far out there, different kind of experience. So it was a pretty good time to be there.
Nick here, originally from Sacramento, California, lived up and down the state my entire life until I made the move out here to Michigan. I'm also an MBA 2, class of 2025 or 24, goodness. And no, it's time. I'm in my third year. I'm in my third year. So I'm very ready to get back out to the real world now. Thanks for having me.
Okay, thank you, everyone. And we are very excited to have you here. We'll start with a quick icebreaker. A very small question, which could mean a lot to you. It is, what makes you feel included? We'll start with you, Bryson, again.
Yeah, I feel like being heard and seen is very important to me. And I feel like it would be important to anyone who wants to be kind of feeling included. Once you're seen and heard, then it feels as though your opinion matters, your story matters. I try to, in any conversation I'm in, try to pull and really listen to what people are saying and just pull little excerpts and see how can I make a connection, because that makes that person feel like I'm actually paying attention to what they're listening to. And it just fosters a relationship. So, yeah.
And you want to just have a good conversation, form a connection.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, more friends the merrier. I'm not going to oppose a friend. So, yeah.
I feel you. I'm right on the same page. How about you, Christian?
Yeah, I think probably the two things that make me feel most connected or included are authenticity and empathy. I am in a place in life where I don't necessarily have a ton of time to be forging tons and tons of new connections, despite being in the full-time program at Ross. And so I crave really authentic relationships with meaning. And I look for that in the social circles that I run in. And I think when able, I also hope to find sources of empathy among the people that I connect with. It doesn't have to be necessarily similar shared experiences, but at least the ability to connect on what makes us who we are and what makes us tick. If I can connect with people like that, that makes me feel deeply included or connected to other people.
That makes a lot of sense because I see a theme emerging here. Both of you are already looking for connections and deep connections. And we all look for authenticity among each other. And I think we can form connections only when we hold some empathy. And the other thing also is that if we are authentic with each other, we are able to build on that empathy as well. So we are just enriching ourselves and each other, the whole community. How about you, Mark?
Yeah, I think mine kind of goes back to having 14 different homes growing up until this point. And so when I think of like what makes me feel connected or included, what I think of is like finding a home for yourself wherever it is. So when I came to Ross, the vet community was a natural home for me, but I knew I wanted to kind of expand my horizons beyond the vet community. And so I joined the ski club, I joined the energy club to kind of like find different groups of people that I could build a home with. And so like skiing is a big part of my identity. And so not necessarily veterans that ski, but just like other people in the world that are passionate about skiing, that's like a home that I find. And so when I think of like what makes me included, it's finding those homes, whatever they mean to you.
So you're looking for some like-minded people, trying to attach one part of your personality to their personality and trying to align on something and form a connection based on that.
Yeah, and I find that like, and maybe this is just me, but I find that like having only one home, for example, if all I ever did at Ross was to hang out with the veteran community, that's like not necessarily ideal, but from like a professional and personal standpoint in my mind. And so broadening horizons to have like multiple homes, and you may have like one predominant identity, right? I'm sure Christian feels the same way as a vet, but having multiple kind of sets of identities that you can kind of like, you know, I want to distance from this one identity, so I'll go to another one today or this week or, you know, however that looks for you individually, I think is kind of a key part of that.
Do you feel like as though you've found your home with joining those other clubs?
Yeah. I think like the veteran community is like certainly like a very tight-knit group of very similar intense experiences. And so that kind of organically is the predominant home. But I think like a couple weeks ago, I needed to get my boots tuned and just kind of fired a message into the abyss on the Slack channel for the ski club and had like 3 responses about where to get my boots fixed in Ann Arbor within half an hour or something like that. So I think like it wasn't necessarily that was like, oh, this is my home now because of these people responding in an immediate sense. But it was like, okay, this is a community that's willing to help with like this very particular problem that I have an interest in, which kind of like made it feel like home, if you will.
Yeah, so I think to Mark's point, I look at the veteran community as my social backstop. That's kind of the term that I've coined to describe its importance in my life. There's this absolutely incredible value for me in knowing that as I am in this phase of my life where I'm trying to venture out and forge new connections and learn more and grow as a leader who's able to handle newer and different environments, there's still this social network that I can go back to and lean on and know that there is this shared sense of humor, this shared lived experience, and this lack of an expectation to have to talk about any of it and still be able to connect with people on a deep basis, both emotionally and just in a way that I think provides so much more deep and enriching value to my life. And so I think, you know, without that, this experience would feel so much more isolating and I would feel so much more ostracized in certain moments. So to be able to, again, lean on that social backstop, it's been invaluable over the last year and a half.
Yeah, I think that's a great thing about Ross, that you have so many different clubs and you can associate yourself to so many different types of communities. For example, you can go to the outdoor club when you want to go on a hike, you want to talk about some personal leadership journey that you want to build, you can go to Sanger. You can always go to so many different places and find yourself, a bit of yourself in each of those places. On that note, how about you, Nick? What makes you feel included?
Yeah, I think two immediate things come to mind for me as well. One is around like the physicality of it, of just literally being invited into a space, like, Absolutely. Like the opening of people's bodies, the reception, looking at you, that eye contact piece, that, engagement, like just a recognition of you as like the human and being that you are, I think is like just a very fundamental one that always sticks with me. And especially anytime coming into a brand new space where, we all have a little bit of that imposter syndrome. We're not sure, am I going to be included? Am I going to, feel like part of this community? Am I going to be able to show up as my authentic self? So having like that physical, almost safety that comes with it, I think is really important. And then once you sort of get that down, when I think about like a next higher order is, did my presence like contribute something to this conversation, to this community? Like if I was not there, would it have been the same experience? And I think for me, that's when I really start to feel like that emotional, that, like truly like mental connection with other folks, when I feel like I've actually been able to contribute to conversations that, when we talk about, from simple topics in class to more complicated ones in friend groups and different organizations, was my voice not only heard and seen, but did it add to it, provide a new perspective, and sort of build on what's going on within that community already?
That's really interesting. On your first point, are there any parts of the physical environment or physical gestures of the community or the people around you that make you feel included? Or are there any specific things that you value a lot or things that you take note of a lot?
Yeah. Well, so I think what's always, both the challenge and the opportunity of being at a program like Ross is we're all coming from a variety of different backgrounds. And so how you express that openness or that inclusion can look quite different depending on the culture you come from. And so that's a piece I always have to remember too is, okay, maybe for me it is that little physical opening of like my body and that eye contact and engagement. But folks from other cultures, whether that be other subcultures within the United States or just other students from international communities, that might express a very different sense of openness. Yeah. That, I remember there was one time that like the professor did like a sort of like a warmish call on me, and in an effort to try to just like bring the class up and sort of like bring the energy up. And I sort of like fired back and made a joke back to the professor, and then passed essentially the question to a classmate of mine who was a bit more quiet, realizing after though that by me sort of prompting them in that way actually did not make them feel as included as I had thought. I thought like, oh, I'm bringing them in on the joke. And so now like, oh, great. Like now I'm going to bring someone else who hasn't had a chance to talk. And it was only afterwards that, because I sort of noticed it in their face a little bit, they felt a bit uneasy, and talking to them after. And they were like, oh yeah, no, it's okay. I just was a bit surprised and I wasn't ready. And I realized, oh, okay, like I would have felt comfortable being brought in that way, but like this person just definitely didn't. And so it was an important reminder on like how we express inclusion, how we make folks feel like welcome into spaces can also vary a lot. So just trying to be empathetic, trying to, recognize, their own experiences, and then just trying your best and, going in with good intentions, I think is the key for all of it.
I think that's really interesting because culture plays a big role in all of our lives. And the thing about Ross is that we are coming from a lot of different cultures. And especially it gets even harder when you're talking about different countries. And then we are talking about different countries. People have different experiences. For example, even people from the same country might be going through many different things, might have gone through a lot of different things in their lives, and might be going through a very different thing today. So I think this was one of the most valuable episodes for me personally. So we had been planning something like this for a very long time, and we wanted to have exactly this conversation, that what makes people feel included, what can we learn from each other as a community, how do we build that community. And just on that, thank you for the beautiful start, everyone. And now we'll jump on to the first segment. And in this segment, we'll talk about the process where you built your story. And for our listeners, all of these great people here, they talk to a large audience of 300, 400 people in a big filled up auditorium, and that takes a lot of courage. And to all our guests here, I would want you to just tell us a little bit about your story, what that event was that you talked at, and let's take a few minutes, whatever you want to share, and the floor is yours. How about you, Nick? We'll start with you this time.
Oh, goodness. Yeah. So the thing we've already been talking about, right, is this idea of like belonging to multiple communities and, this idea of like intersectionality that, we're super complicated humans. And so you can say, I maybe have a few identities that are most prominent, or certainly that if you look and you see someone that are the most apparent, but like myself included, like I identify with so many of these different identities that, at one point you want to try to define yourself a little bit, but you don't want to be limited by just one as well. And one thing I really wanted to focus on within my story that was part of the OutX event was the intersection I had in my late teens going into undergrad around both what I figured out was my sexuality at the time starting to manifest, me coming to terms with being a gay and queer man, while also the recognition of some of the mental health issues that I was starting to deal with. And those two things coming together at, a pretty interesting time, both, California we think of as a very reliably like solid blue state, but this was at a time in 2008, right after Prop 8 happened, that by voting yes, affirmed that marriage was only between a man and a woman. And I remember having these really difficult conversations with my parents who, growing up Roman Catholic, they felt that marriage was a religious thing, not a civil rights thing, that like two separate issues. And so having to have those conversations with them while then also having mental health issues and dealing with those two pieces was incredibly difficult. And a lot of times they felt connected. They felt that, was I depressed? Was I going through, these highly anxious moments? Was I feeling all this self-doubt because I was gay? Or like, because I was gay, that's like why it's manifesting as me having all this guilt and I'm doing something wrong and I am, going against my faith. And so it was a very intertwined thing that, led to a mini health crisis I talk about in my story. And then, really then focusing on, okay, well, if I start to come to terms with who I am, then how do I begin to love and accept myself for who I am and reach out to help and support for that? And so I think that was, a primary focus of my story, but a reminder too that, these multiple identities, they not only inform different parts of you, but can almost come at odds with each other. It can almost feel like conflicting things. And I think it's a story I've had throughout my life. Like I'm mixed race also. Like my dad's from Colombia. My mom's, American. And, I present like very, very like white passing, but my last name's Rojas. And so like I get a lot of this very like, oh, what's going on here? Like, who are you? Like my like Spanish is like decent, but like not good enough. So when like a native speaker comes up to me and they just like totally like pop off in Spanish and I'm like, oh goodness, okay, like I can not ready.
Survive in LA, but that's about it.
Like exactly. Like I'm from California, so like I like have that that bit, but yeah, no, so it's just these multiple identities that come, interplaying but crashing in with each other.
Yeah, I think we all start developing identities in our teenage, and there's so many different factors that restrict it. Like we are not able to grow, bring our actual personality out. And a lot of factors are at play. And I think a lot of has gone through that. As you mentioned, you had some mental health issues. I think a lot of people do feel that way. And some of them are probably not able to get out of it or bounce back as well as probably a lot of other people. Nick, can you share a few tips or what you did in that moment when you were facing all of this? How did you cope with that? Did you talk to someone? Did you do some particular activity to just bring out your real self and go out there and battle with the world out there?
Yeah. So, oh goodness, like the amount of notes and things I would tell a 17-year-old Nick are vast. And some things, come with time, come with experience, come with living those experiences, right? In whatever identity or struggle it may be. I think the biggest one I always try to tell people is remember that you have a wide variety of people in your life who love you for like just exactly how you are. Like the good, quote unquote, the bad, quote unquote, the ambiguous that are neither good or bad, right? But are just traits and qualities about yourself. And to remember that you can lean on them, and those who do truly love you for you will always be there. They might not love every action you do. They might not fully understand every identity about you. My parents, I feel very fortunate that although we grew up very religious, had an open enough mind to understand, well, this is an experience my son's going through. We have this understanding on what, marriage should be, what love should be, even ideas on like masculinity and femininity and like what gets identified to certain people, that it was through their primary focus on loving me that everything else began to start to not be as crucial or as important, because loving me was the key part. And so, if that means my son, me, like at the same time loves sports with my dad, but also loves, musical theater, like those are not gay or straight things. They are just Nick things. Yeah. And so those were, I think, important things that helped me, was just remembering I have people that love and support me. And then ultimately, I think like the toughest person to get to try to find to love you is yourself. And
it's a work in progress, right?
Oh my goodness, right? Still working on that. So
that definitely makes a lot of sense, especially so like I talked about a similar thing at VetX about like the challenges of like mental health going through like very high stakes scenarios, which again looks different for everybody. But I think that was one of the things that I had to realize like going through this journey is like at a certain point you just have to like give yourself grace and be like, look, I'm not perfect. Nobody's perfect. Like the scale of like whatever my mess ups are, like it's probably not as big as you make them out to be. I remember there was like a study I read and it was about like how we perceive our own like physical attractiveness. And like it was a universal trait that like everybody sees themselves worse, like from a physical standpoint than anybody else sees them. And I think that's like, I mean, lots of leaps to make here on that one necessarily, but I think it is reflective of the attitude of like, we are our own harshest critics.
Yeah, I think that is one of the hardest things to do. I have been trying to practice that myself, but still have not been able to do that. Do you want to talk about anything that you specifically practice to make sure that you're giving yourself grace in a specific moment when it is getting tough and you are not really, let's say, performing at par with where you want to be? Is there something that you do to resolve that?
I think when I think about like giving myself, I mean, I'm already terrible at it and I'm not sure that I'm the best person to take advice from, but...
You just say not to talk bad about yourself.
Right. It's a work in progress.
Okay, yes.
Yeah. When I think about like giving, I think particularly of that like very defining event in my life where like, and I talk about this in my VetX speech, but it was a really, really, really bad week that I felt personally responsible for. And I think coming off of that, I think the first thing I would have told myself is like, take a deep breath and step away from it. I think like I was so obsessed in the moment with doing the thing that I had set out to do that I had kind of lost vision of everything else in my life. Like, like Nick talks about how there are people that will love you for who you are. And I had completely lost sight of that. One, I just didn't really come up for air very much to like take a second to breathe. And then two was just like, through a series of experiences that week, I had felt that that wasn't necessarily the case for me anymore. And so I think the first thing I would say is like, take a day, take an hour, take a minute, whatever you need to just step away and breathe and just like exist with yourself for a minute. And I think that reckoning of existing with yourself, you kind of come to a lot of the realizations that Nick talked about of these are actually the things that matter, and what you think is kind of like career altering, life altering, whatever the case may be, like it's going to be okay.
Yeah.
You will wind up where you belong, and where you belong is the place that will make you feel safe, supported, successful.
I think that's a really great tip. So recently I was at a leadership conference and these were C-suite executives, partners at consulting firms and CXOs at some major companies of the US. And we were talking about exactly this. When you feel extreme emotion or you think that you have failed at work, what do you do? Because these people are CXOs. They have been in the industry for 20, 25 years and you do not reach not even the CXO level. You do not survive in the corporate world, or you always fail. Like there will be moments when you will be criticized. You feel that you have been put down. You feel that you have not performed as well. So we just asked them like, how do you cope with that? And they had the same answer. Like some people just sit with it for a day. As you said, some people have a hot pen technique and they'll just write down everything that they're feeling in a moment and they'll revisit that next morning. And they feel that, oh my God, why was I even feeling that way? It does not matter that much. And I think the other thing, as Nick mentioned, just relying on people who love you, who value you. I think just going back to those people gives you a reality check. And I think in these moments, we need someone to tell us that it is not that big a deal. Like, we have been living for so long in such diverse environment and we have been doing great. We are at Ross. We have been doing great. So everything will be all right. On that note, Christian, how about you? What did you talk about at WetX?
Yeah, so I talked generally about the transition from the military to where I am right now as an MBA2 at Ross. And so what I used to kind of drive that narrative was a metaphor or an image of a box. I talked about this transition from a highly structured atmosphere that had been established for me. And I used this idea of there being this box that was represented by all of the structure that the military offered for the better part of, about 13 years of my life. I started at West Point when I was 17 and I'm 32 now, and I left the Army 2 years ago. So do the math. I talked about how there were these feelings of resentment getting out of the military and suddenly feeling like I had been abandoned and feeling guilty that I yearned for the ease and the comfort of a life that I'd had before, and this kind of sense that I was lost and just kind of like rudderless, and trying to figure out where to find sources of meaning, trying to find things that matter to me, where to find communities that matter to me, all while grappling with the desire to distance myself from the veteran community, which is the only one that was going to understand fully what I was going through. And so throughout my speech, I talked about how the box became a friend while I was in the military, in that it helped me deal with heavier and heavier situations throughout my career. Anything from struggling to learn to fly a helicopter, which, it's not easy, give yourself some grace, but it provided the structure that I needed to double my efforts, right? And then I kind of build up to arguably one of the hardest days of my life, where crews that I was managing that day were unable to come to the aid of a 19-year-old kid who'd been harmed in a firefight with the Taliban, and he died. But I showed up to work 7 hours later and was ready to go for my next shift like nothing had happened. So then I transitioned out of the Army and realized that the box was never mine. It was something that was on loaner to me. It kind of protected me and my family and my happiness. And then all of a sudden I'm out and I don't have that. And I felt very vulnerable. And so started talking about the lows that came with that transition to Ross. Year one was difficult. And then I talk about, kind of using this last year to build my own box from scratch and realizing that I could do that, and defining what those elements that make up what it is that makes life rich and beautiful and fulfilling, and ends on a more optimistic note than where it goes in the middle there. Yeah.
So how do you feel about going back to the real world after Ross?
I've never been to the real world. That's part of it.
Yeah.
Like I said, man, I started at West Point when I was 17 in a highly, highly structured environment. And then I went straight, I majored in a useless major because I knew what my job was going to be when I graduated, and it didn't matter, right? And so I kind of was just able to pursue what I was passionate about. I was able to fulfill a lifelong dream of becoming a pilot, did all those things, and then all of a sudden I got there and was like, I don't know if I love this anymore. And so, yeah, it's interesting that when we graduate in May, that will be my first time having a job outside of my summer internship. And so, emotions are mixed. There's definitely this continued sense that I have no idea what I'm doing, but also this excitement to put what I've learned to use, and hopefully make a positive impact somewhere doing something. And so, yeah, it's I would say tapered optimism. It's there, but it's also, there's some fear there. But it's having the willingness and the vulnerability to admit that.
Yes. And you will always have the Ross community and your loved ones to bank on.
Yeah.
And we already have those great tips. Give yourself some grace.
Yeah, no, that's why I married a therapist. Like, if Mark can't remind me, my wife, who's an amazing therapist, not my therapist, but she's full of useful tidbits when I really need them. When we break glass in case of emergency, Maggie is definitely my rock. So yeah.
Nice. How about you, Bryson? What do you talk about?
Yeah. So my story, I was able to share my story on the platform of the Singer Leadership Story Lab event. And my story actually there's a theme here, right? And that's what I love about sharing stories, pouring into yourself for Christian and like not talking badly, mental health, things of that nature for both Nick and Mark. Mine was very similar in that something that I've been living with for the majority, actually all of my life. I grew up in a white community, majority white community, and I was the only Black female in a lot of my classes, and I was taunted a lot or discriminated against, not only by my classmates, but unfortunately by my own extended family members. Not my immediate, not my parents, not my sister. They poured into me, but cousins, aunts, and uncles. It's called monkey. I can't play hide and seek with them because I'm too dark. They would only be able to see my teeth and eyes, things of that nature. Yeah, it was pretty rough. So I took everything that they were saying and internalized it and made it become my truth. It was tough. I wanted so badly not to be me. I even begged my mom to allow me to bleach my skin, straighten my hair, which I chemically straighten it, so I relax it. And it was just a long journey. And I actually came here for undergrad. And my mom said, I'm going to challenge you to do something, step out of your comfort zone to build up your confidence. There was a modeling organization, and she's like, just go for it. I was scared out of my mind because I don't know anything about modeling, but I went for it. After those 4 years, I modeled in every modeling show, built up my confidence, loved myself. And I still felt as though like the world wasn't seeing, like, yes, in this community, Ross pours into you. The University of Michigan at large pours into you. The people that come here are empathetic and authentic in that way. But I still kind of felt some type of way until L'Oreal, the hair conglomerate, reached out to me to do a modeling gig. And I was like, wait, how did you find me? One? Like,
what is this?
Kind of scary. But that was just kind of a wake-up call to me, like, wait, people do see that I'm beautiful and, I should pour into myself in terms of speaking life and beauty and all that. But here's the thing about my story. My story is not unique. A lot of people, Blacks specifically, in America, experience this exact thing I'm talking about. So what was like deeper in my story is really just taking the narratives that serve me and like going with that, not letting other people's narratives kind of become my truth, which is what I was originally talking about. So essentially that's what I shared. And it's very much a work in progress, right? Every day I'm still battling, like looking in the mirror and being like, you got this, like, don't worry about it. You're going to shine. So, yeah.
I think there's something so beautiful that you use modeling as a vehicle to like discover yourself and to maybe like come to terms with your appreciation or embrace of your identity. Just because I feel like that world can often be seen as vain or be seen as a vehicle for negativity. Like there's a lot of negative drivers around that industry. And I think the fact that you were able to use that as a vehicle for something so beautiful and positive is really cool. I think there's like a really interesting stark contrast there, but it's also really interesting and beautiful that you were able to like discover so much more about yourself through that. That's really cool.
Yeah, thanks. So work in progress. But
as are we all.
Right, yeah, exactly. But I think that's the beauty of life. I think we're always going to be learning, no matter what. And we just have to give each other grace. Yeah. That's like been the theme, right? Like give each other grace.
Exactly. When you were probably not feeling as good about your appearance, you were actually rewarded with a modeling job, which is supposed to be a big deal in the world. When you were not giving yourself grace, the world gave you grace with that. I think that is a very big deal because we see ourselves, we criticize ourselves so much, and the world sees us very differently. I think that is one very, very important thing. But all of these stories seem to be very deep. Like you're talking about your feelings, your most vulnerable self. I want to know what motivated you to tell these stories on stage in front of such a big audience. And why do you think it is important to share stories, if at all?
It's funny. I actually didn't want to tell my story. I was actually petrified to tell my story. I was like, I'm not doing this. Like, there's no way. There we go. That negative talk, right? And it's like,
Grace given.
Yeah, right. Thank you. But I was actually, this might be TMI, but taking a shower, and I was like thinking to myself, like, how am I not going to tell my story? Because I'm scared of what other people are going to think about me, when literally that's what my story is all about. Yeah. Not caring about what other people think about me and just pouring into myself the love and grace and all of that. So it was very challenging, but I just pushed forward and told myself, I have to tell this story, because even if it doesn't connect for most people, it's going to connect with somebody.
Yeah.
And I think it's important because, as you see with all of our stories, there's a theme here. Like, we are all living different versions of like lives, but there's a connection here, and that's what brings us together as just a human race. So
I think I totally agree with that, because growing up, I used to be a super heavy kid. I was bullied a lot, and I was always conscious about my appearance. Rather, I should say that I'm always conscious about my appearance, even now. And I also was not sure whether I wanted to share my story. I shared my story on East Meets West last year, and I felt the exact same thing. But why I went ahead and shared my story was because when I went to these events, OutX, WetX, Story Lab, in my first year, so I'm an MBA too, so in my first year, I went to all of these events, and I could always find one person who I really aligned on something with, some particular value, some particular experience, some particular learning. And I was getting out of these events with some really good connections, because they were vulnerable, and I could then be vulnerable in front of them, because now I knew a totally different side of my classmates. And that happened after my experience with East Meets West as well, because some people who aligned with my story, they came to me, and then we started a conversation, and that was one great way to form such deep connections. And I think that is why, as you said, like, it is very valuable to share these stories.
Yeah. And I also feel like you can inspire people to then share theirs, because they might be just as scared as you once were. So,
How about you, Christian?
Yeah, I think what motivated me, again, I talked about that metaphor of the box, the image of the box, and what that meant for me throughout a decade and a half of my life. And I came up with that idea probably like towards the end of last year, so second semester of last year, and was just, I have multiple friends in the community throughout Ann Arbor that I've kind of bumped into just by accident. Like, a lot of them are vets, a lot of them are parents, a lot of them are grad students in the various schools. And what I noticed was that a lot of us were struggling with the same things, and really struggling to articulate or define what it was we were feeling in those moments. And I had tried to iterate on what it was that I was missing so much, what it was about the Army, which I had resented and wanted to get out of for so long. Like, what was it that was causing me to want to go back at times, and why did I feel so guilty in those moments? And so when I was finally able to kind of do that creative project and understand, or be able to verbalize it in terms of a simple object, I saw that and started sharing it with friends. And there were a lot of aha, oh shit moments where my friends were like, oh man, that's it. And it's like, okay, we're on to something. And it felt like there was some value to that, to being able to put words to that. But then I think there's a lot of fear among the veteran community that you will never be fully understood when you get out. And I think a lot of that is because, you spend so much of your life living a very specific way, and just kind of not being present in the lives of the people who raised you, who loved you, who you associated with before you started. And so there's this fear that you'll never be able to assimilate back into normal society after you're done with your service. And so I wanted to be able to verbalize that idea of the box in a way that created a sense of understanding or a sense of empathy with everybody in the audience and not just the vets. Like I wanted that metaphor to land with everybody, because we all came here from some background that had some sort of structure to it that helped keep us going throughout difficult periods. And doesn't matter what the severity of those difficulties were. It seemed like that was something that would have enough common ground to kind of bring everybody together in a sense. And I felt like that would be a good way to kind of serve as a bridge to maybe a window into what it's like to be a veteran once you're out, but also for the vets to be like seen or to feel like the folks around them maybe have more of an understanding of what they're going through than sometimes they want to admit.
Yeah. I think there's a very key thing in what you said. It is very important to vocalize what people are feeling or what a broader community is feeling. For example, you said that veterans normally are feeling this way, that people might not understand them. And while the rest of the community might not even know that, they might not realize this thing. And once you share these experiences on stage with the entire community, then hopefully they know how the entire community can make veterans feel included.
Yeah, I think there's some validity to that. I think it's trying to normalize being able to just share that depth of emotion that you're feeling through your lens as a veteran, but also I think being willing to let those guards down and understand that other people are experiencing deeply similar things just through a slightly different lens. Being able to kind of strip out the context sometimes, not so much that it sterilizes a situation, but stripping out context and just focusing on how it is you feel or why it is you feel that way. Like that can serve as a deeply powerful source of connection with people that you might not otherwise connect.
Yeah, absolutely. We are all mostly looking for a fit one way or the other. On that note, Mark, you also spoke on VEDX. What motivated you to speak on VEDX and how did you prepare for it?
Yeah, I kind of had like an inverse experience from Christian. When I was thinking about my story, they asked like, who wants to speak at VEDX? And I just kind of like put together an outline because I was like, this may be something worth talking about. And then when they said, oh, you're picked, I was like, oh my God, I actually have to tell this story. All of a sudden, like, whoa, like, what do I do with this? It was kind of like more of a rumination that I had just submitted on a whim. And then they were like, nope, you're speaking. Okay,
Great.
How do I turn this like whim of an idea and personal rumination into something that like people can relate to and understand? And so what I thought about it as I was kind of like going through the preparation process with Sanger was like, okay, what about my stories is relatable for people and what do people need to hear, talk about, whatever the case may be? And so mine, even in the veteran community, I thought of my experience as almost unique. That there's lots of conversations about like veteran suicide, and there's lots of conversations about people on active duty committing suicide, but you never really think that it's going to be you. It's always just like an ethereal number. Mm-hmm. And even now, it doesn't really feel like it was me.
Yeah.
And so I think like trying to take that experience of like, it's somebody else's story, making it my own, and then somehow still making that relatable. I felt like that was an obligation because people talk about it, but it never really feels like it's going to happen to you. And so when I was going through this, coming to the point about why I spoke is that I felt it was an obligation.
Yeah.
Because, suicide happens and it's kind of hard to talk to people after it happens. And so I felt that like my story was kind of like as close as you can get to somebody that did that without like them being dead. And so it felt like an obligation to explain the mindset, explain what gets you to that point, veteran or otherwise. And then from there, deliver a message about, like, it's going to be okay. That was kind of like one of the taglines in my speech was like, no matter what happens, like you are where you are because of who you are and it will work out for you in the long run, like guaranteed, promise, no problem. And so that was kind of like the general rationale was like, somebody needs to talk about this and maybe it's one person in the entire crowd, but that could change their life for the better. And so that it felt like an obligation, even if it's just one person.
No, absolutely. I think suicide is like an extreme case of mental health issues. And unfortunately, some communities, some cultures blame the person with the mental health issues. Like, why are you making a big deal out of something XYZ? Which is not the right thing. And it is important to vocalize a lot of things. People blame people who commit suicide, and that is absolutely not the right thing. And in a lot of cases, the society is also to blame. We always need to create a supportive ecosystem so that people are able to share these things. On that note, Nick, would love to know what motivated you to speak.
Oh, yeah. Hearing these stories has been really nice because there's truly times in your life where you feel like I am so screwed up. Like I am so, there is something so fundamentally wrong with me. I am broken. I can't be fixed. And like, that's it. And like, that's sort of the end of the story. And that's how I felt at that point, when I was 17. And I think like the biggest growth piece I've had since then is this understanding of like, oh my goodness, wow, like I am truly not the only person that's felt this way. Also, like I wasn't broken and needed to get fixed. I just needed to start to come to terms with these different identities and elements of myself and reach out for the help. And I had never shared about this story and experience with anyone except my immediate family. And to make that jump from that to like a whole group of people, I think for me was my ultimate way of really trying to say, like, there is truly nothing to be ashamed of this anymore. Like, I don't need to hold it so close to me. I don't need to be so afraid to talk about, these different identities I was struggling with, my close, run-in with suicide, that it was something I think I was just so ashamed of. And I was like, look at me now. Like I've grown so much. Like I don't even want to give that old identity or that old thought process like the time of day. And I feel very fortunate in that journey that I'm on. But recognizing, oh goodness, like there's probably others in this audience or who are friends of others who might be going through this exact same thing, and not the exact identities aligning or the exact same issues, but being able to talk about it, to be able to remove the stigma of it, particularly around, mental health, I think is so crucial. And that was ultimately, I think, what helped put me over was, if not me, then who?
Yeah. I think your story, I remember from Outex, it was a very powerful story. And after that story, I felt like I have gone through some stuff in life, but there are so many people out there who have seen much worse. And they have been able to cope up with that and come back so much stronger. And I was like, then I can just go back, revisit so many stories that I've heard out here and be like, I can get through my small bit out here. So I derive power from all of these stories, and it is one of the most valuable things that comes out of it as well.
Yeah. And I think like with that too is, hearing these other stories of folks who, face adversity, have gone through troubling times is helpful. But I also don't want folks to maybe have to make like the direct comparison of like, oh, well, mine's not as bad. Right. So then, so now I feel guilty about feeling this way. Cause that was so much of it. It was like once again, like I grew up with a good family. I had a roof over my head. I was fed. I had good friends. And yet I was having all these feelings. I was just incredibly depressed. I was waking up in the morning, just not wanting to exist.
Why can't I be okay?
Why can't I be okay? I literally have everything externally in place. And there are other people across the globe who are waking up with far worse conditions than me. Yeah. And yet they have the will to go on and to live life. And I can't, get out of my room in my suburban home to get out there. And so I just felt even more guilty about it. Right. And so just the sense of like, hearing these stories are good, but like, don't feel like you need to compare yourself or like this race to the bottom on how awful mine is. So now I can feel good enough to be able to live it because it's still your experience. It's your life. That's what you know.
Yeah.
That was definitely one of the challenges when I was putting mine together too, was like, okay, how, I thought it was a very high stakes scenario and like objectively looking at it, it felt pretty high stakes and looked pretty high stakes, but like everybody deals with a different kind of problem. And so like my version of really intense is not your version of intense or Christian's version of intense or Arpit or Bryson's version of intense. Everybody has a different kind of experience with that. And the analogy I draw in my head is like a newborn baby experiencing the world, right? Like somebody pinches you now, you're like, ow. a newborn baby, it's 2 degrees colder than they like, and that's the coldest pain they've ever endured. And so, the baby isn't just as much pain as you getting, or less perhaps than you getting pinched, but it's the worst thing they've experienced up to that point. And so overcoming that worst experience it looks very different for everybody.
And everyone deals with it in a very different way.
Mm-hmm.
This episode is sponsored by the Ross School of Business at the University of Michigan. Through our podcast, you can connect with the people and experiences that define the Ross way. Check out our other podcasts, such as Working for the Weekend, an exploration of the part-time MBA experience, Business and Society, a business podcast with award-winning Michigan Ross faculty, and Down to Business, a new interview series with Ross alum in the C-suite, hosted by Dean Sharon Matusik. All podcasts can be found on Apple Podcasts and Spotify.
So coming into Ross, we have probably a good idea of who we are. And yet Ross is a very diverse experience and a unique experience at that. And there are so many things happening, a community that is very different from anything else, perhaps, that you have experienced. So how do you balance maintaining your identity with blending into the broader Ross culture? And what would you recommend, let's say, the administration do differently, or what changes would you make to the Ross community or the social setup out here? Anything that comes to mind? We can start with you, Bryson, this time.
Yeah, this is interesting because I think given like the story I shared, I built up a lot of confidence and I'm like loving myself and everything like that, but definitely coming to Ross and there's so many opportunities here, like, and so many ways that you can like just things that you can be a part of. And I definitely think I took on a little too much because I was so excited. So the balance has been challenging in terms of maintaining my identity and who I am, but also showing up in the ways that, say, a certain organization might need me to show up. So I think what I've been doing a lot is if I am having a conversation or doing something in a certain way where instinctively it does not feel right or it doesn't feel like me, like, you have those moments where you're like talking to somebody and you're like, feel like you're holding back a bit. Like you're not really saying what you would normally say. And if you're talking to a friend, that's when I would kind of like pause. Obviously, if the conversation is going, sometimes you can't do it like organically, but kind of reflect back and be like, okay, going forward, don't do that. Like, be more mindful of how I'm having those conversations or how I'm showing up. Or, maybe you're doing too much. Pull back here so that way you can show up more like yourself in the events or things that you really, really want to be at. You can't do it all. You just can't. And then in terms of like what Ross could do better, I don't know. I feel like I'm biased here, right? Like I've been here twice. And it's like Michigan's my like blood at this point. But I don't know. I think the university does a really good job of making sure that they build an authentic community. To sound repetitive, I probably sound cliche, but it just is what it is. I mean, some truth to cliches, if I'm being transparent here. If anything, it's just like the fine details. Michigan does a good job at details and building that authentic or transparent community, but there are certain instances, like if I'm being completely transparent here, MAP, I know some people, me being one of them, where wasn't able to celebrate with my team because our numbers were mixed up on the envelopes. But that really speaks to somebody's like experience as well as like connecting with people and maintaining who they are. So like, it's so small, but it can really impact on somebody's like experience and how they show up in the community.
Yeah, I think that is a really good point. On your earlier bit, when you said that in some settings, basically you feel energized, but in some settings you feel like it is taking away energy.
Yes.
I think that is really important, and that is something that I have also figured out. And it is very important to just be more intentional about that. For sure, you don't want to be very busy, but also you do not want to choose things where you feel that it is just taking away a lot of your energy.
Exactly.
How about you, Christian?
Yeah, I guess I can maybe answer it with like a brief story. But I mean, when I started here, I was convinced that I was going to do everything in my power to avoid the veteran community or being identified or labeled as a member of it. I thought paying the dues to the AFA and like showing up to maybe one happy hour would be the extent of my efforts. And now I'm a VEDX participant and the co-VP for prospective students. Like I spend a lot of my free time talking to folks that are trying to get into Ross and don't know how to translate their experience into a way that can be understood by those who are reading their applications. So I think like I didn't realize the value of leaning into that source of identity and not resenting it, and understanding that just because I had this negative perception of what a veteran community might look like, it says nothing about the fine nuances about the people that comprise that community, and finding the folks within it that I identified with most and who have become some of my best friends. I think Ross has done a really great job at creating an incredibly diverse, both diverse in the representation in the student body, but also just diverse set of opportunities that allow me to feel like I can take a risk. A saying that I use a lot is I'm bowling with the bumpers up right now. Like I feel like I'm allowed to just kind of huck it down the alley and bounce off the sides until I eventually hit a pin. And that has allowed me to maybe take risks both socially, professionally, academically that otherwise I might or would have been fearful of. And it's also allowed me the space to come to terms with the fact that that veteran community is not something that I need to ignore or try to distance myself from. It's something that I need to lean into because it's what fills my cup quite often. And so I think that diverse set of opportunities while also providing me room to recharge. I talked about earlier, I think using the vet community as like my social backstop gives me that opportunity to recharge when I need it, but simultaneously go find some cool new thing to attempt, right? That's, I think, been invaluable in that it's kind of helped me strike that balance in my ongoing newfound identity as I get further and further from when I left the Army. Yeah.
Do you feel the empathy that you find in the veteran community that allows you to be authentic in the remaining part of the community?
Yeah, I think something that's really interesting is I felt so different from my peers when I showed up here during orientation. I felt like an absolute hammer in a drawer full of knives. Like I felt like a blunt instrument when I first showed up because I just did not know necessarily how to interact with the nuance that is sometimes required. And a lot of that is just never having to do so in a previous life. And so I think I have been afforded opportunities to ask questions that are direct and uncomfortable and to really connect with people on a deep and impactful way, or at least impactful to me, and forge connections with folks outside of that community while simultaneously, again, crafting that sense of identity that I now have a couple years out, and feel more empowered to continue, being a more inclusive leader, being a more empathetic person. I think Ross has definitely provided me the tools to continue to kind of understand the value in those approaches and being able to interact with folks in that way.
Yeah, that's beautiful. How about you, Mark?
Yeah, I think being at Ross, one of the amazing parts of this experience has been like the ability to associate various identities very quickly and very freely, right? Like I showed up on campus within a week, the veteran group chat was already 30 people. And I think within 2 weeks, we had every single one in my class. It's really easy to join clubs. It's really easy to join organizations. It's really easy to like find your home and kind of be your authentic self in that way. I think one of the challenges that I struggle with still, and which I think Ross could improve, and it's a little bit of a zero-sum game, is that Ross emphasizes like heavy collaboration, heavy friendship, be your authentic self. But, and Christian can relate to this, there are certain components of being a veteran that are just like really rough around the edges that are not
sometimes
like,
I just don't want that.
Right. Yeah. Like it's like there are certain components, and I'm sure this is relatable to whatever community it may be at Ross. Is there like certain components of that community that like are not necessarily for public forum? And it's not that it's like wrong to be that authentic self with the right community. It's just hard to be that authentic self in a broader community.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the things that was kind of short-shrifted coming to Ross. It was kind of like understood a little bit. Like I think of this in the context of being a veteran. You know, it was coming to Ross, there were certain things of like coming from the military, like probably don't need to do XYZ thing, whatever it may be, or say a certain thing. I don't have like a very particular example right now, but there were just certain things coming out of my last community that I said, okay, I shouldn't be doing this. But I didn't realize once I got to Ross that that list of things I shouldn't be doing is much longer than I thought it was. And also that like there is a place and a time for those things. It is just not in public forum. And that was not well described to me when I got here. And I wish that I had like known that coming in, if that makes sense.
You're nodding your head quite strongly, Nick.
You're watching Mark and I become adults like 1 minute at a time. Like,
Truly.
Yeah, no, like that so deeply resonates with me, Mark. So prior to that, I'm also on the older side. I'm 32, and I moved to San Francisco in 2015, and like entered this next phase of my life where, and I don't even know how this happened, but it just somehow happened where within like a year and a half, 2 years time, like I literally didn't have a single straight friend. Like I had no gay friends growing up, never an undergrad. And then I moved to SF and I find this like beautiful, diverse queer community. And then same thing, coming back, like, and it almost like, it's weird, but like hearing this your experience as veterans, it almost like we too have this own weird community that's not part of the normal world. Yeah. And like, and we're not serving, we're not doing anything good. We're just being like, we're just being chaotic queer people. But it is just not normal society. And so coming back here, I'm also like, oh, wow, like, okay, I need to reorient. But then what was doubly tough is like, as we all know, no one culture is a monolith. And same thing with like gay and queer folks. Like a gay in San Francisco is not a gay from Dallas, Texas. Like they are very different. They might like the same gender, or there might be a few commonalities and they know who like Lady Gaga is, but like things start to end there very quickly. Ideas around relationships and like what you talk about with friends and what is inbounds and out of bounds in public spaces, like exactly what you're talking about, Mark. And so coming here and I was like, oh, well, immediately I'm going to be part of Out for Business. I'm going to have all my same gay and queer friends again. It's going to be fantastic. I'm just going to be in business school. And then just this immediate wake up call was like, oh, wow. Like just because we like dudes does not mean we are best friends. Like, and it was that, you know, that reminder and like, oh, okay, goodness. Okay. Like what are other commonalities? And like going back to, oh, it's actually shared values that are most important thing to me. And it was like a reminder of like, oh goodness, like how you show up, how you build that community is really important. And oddly enough, like I still very much like feel gay and queer and everything, but I haven't built that community solely at Ross. I've been able to identify and build that in other ways, in other spaces. And I've really gravitated towards like the sustainability and the herb community here. Like that's been my fallback. Those are my people that I can have unique conversations with that I can't have anywhere else that I've really, really enjoyed. And so with that, like, you know, my offering up of a little bit of advice to Ross would be, I think we have so many of these different events going on and you want to be a good ally. You want to be supportive. You even just your friends, like working tirelessly on different programming. But because I think there is such a desire of, oh, we need to put on so much to represent this group and I need to put on so much to represent this group, you then have like a dizzying array of things to do. And I'm like, well, why can't this event be more of a collaboration between these 2 or 3 different groups and identities? Like it would only enrich in the value of it instead of everyone feeling like they need to put on their 20 different events in a semester to like warrant the club existing. And I'm like, is it really worth it if we got like, you know,
4 of us?
Yeah, exactly. Like 8 people showing up to something that you've labored over for 2 months when instead you could collab with 2 other communities and put on a really great event that brings them together in a joint conversation. And I think like this is an excellent example of that too, of like, oh wow, like we all come from these different communities, these different voices of Ross that are being brought together, but like so many of these common threads that are weaving through that like are outside our identities, they're just being human. They're having similar experiences with different backgrounds.
I mean, everything you just said related in so many different ways. Like you talked about having straight friends and like then moving to San Francisco and having to assimilate to a new setting. Like Mark and I at least for me, I used to collect civilian friends, right? Like if I could move,
100%.
I knew that I was starting to like fit in a new city when every time the army moved me, if I made friends that were civilians. And like if I had friends that had nothing to do with military, I'm doing it here now. Like if I have friends that are in either different schools or ideally have no affiliation with the university, it's like, now this is becoming home, at least for now. But like it's just, there's so much common ground through all of these narratives. It's really cool.
Yeah, I think we are always looking for commonalities, looking for comfort. We are looking for authenticity. We are looking to form deep connections. And I'm hoping that such good conversations that we have had out here, all of these conversations can probably set an example of probably some of the conversations that you might want to have out there, or a lot of other people might want to have. A lot of people might be seeking emotional support, or they want to lend a hand to a friend, for example. And thank you, everyone, on that note, for being here. This has been a very beautiful episode. With that, we come to the end of the episode. Business Beyond Usual is brought to you by the Ross School of Business and the University of Michigan. Today's episode was produced by Arpit Sharma. Executive producers of BBU are JT Godfrey, David Amarim, John Brown, and Arpit Sharma. Special thanks to Jonah Brockman, who did our editing today. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time, go blue, and this is Business Beyond Usual.